Welcome back to the Wingspan Podcast, episode 36. I'm Doug Barak, joined by my co-host Chris Mulholland of Nets Daily and our special guest. He's a Naismith Hall of Fame sports journalist, covering thousands of Knicks games throughout his remarkable career. He's also worked 40 years working with the New York Times for over 25 years. He's also author or co-author of 8 books, recently releasing his latest book, Our Last Season, a writer, a fan, and a friendship.
We welcome Harvey Araton to the podcast. Thank you for taking some time out of your morning to join Doug and I. How are you doing?
I'm good. Good to be on with both of you.
Glad to have you on.
We're glad to have you on.
So, what have you been up to since the world has been put on hold by COVID?
Well, a lot of days that kind of blur together. I haven't really gone very far, but I've been staying busy. I think when COVID struck, when the lockdown began, I in fact had just gotten home from a brief getaway to the Caribbean with my wife and friends of ours to celebrate our 35th wedding anniversary. And we actually were flying. I guess we were kind of in denial a little bit because we flew on March 4th when the outbreak had certainly started in New York and in New Rochelle. There was a serious outbreak there. And we got back on Monday the 9th, as I recall, and then, all hell kind of broke loose that week. So I guess we were fortunate in that sense that we flew when the virus was spreading pretty quickly. But a lot of, I've managed to keep busy. I was still tying up loose ends of this book, reading galleys and writing book photo captions, things of that nature, proofreading it, and then I've been doing some work for the Times. I still contribute on an occasional basis. One thing I've been doing quite a bit of for the Times during the pandemic is writing advanced obituaries on aging NBA icons, which is kind of a weird gig in that you're writing these things you hope you'll never see, or at least you won't see anytime soon. But I kind of enjoy the research and consider them to be, historical documents in the archives of the Times for people who, rate those kinds of things. So I've managed to stay busy. I think the longer this goes, that the more difficult that will become, unless I wind up with another book project soon. But for the most part, it's been okay. Things around northern New Jersey were pretty good in the summer. So moving around, going out for coffee, things of that nature, riding my bike, wasn't that bad.
Yeah, that sounds good for the most part. I'm glad your trip went smoothly and that everything kind of transitioned not too hectically for you. So you're very accomplished in the field of journalism. So can you take us through that journey from your first job to, you pretty much mentioned to what you're up to now?
Yeah, it's something that since the book is sort of a semi-memoir, and I deal with the genesis of my career in it. And journalism was not something I necessarily aspired to when I was young in high school. Never worked for my school paper, but I think it was basically a couple of weeks after I graduated high school, someone who I was connected to in Staten Island, New York, where I grew up through playing basketball, asked me if I was interested in working for the Staten Island Advance, which is a part of the Newhouse chain, connected to like the Star Ledger was a sister paper. And in Staten Island, particularly in those days, everybody read the Advance. I mean, Staten Island was sort of like a world unto itself as an island borough in New York. So I had no idea what I could possibly do when he asked me that. But it turned out that essentially I was, an office gopher. I stripped the wires and drove into Manhattan. These are the days before the internet and computers, even, really dating myself here. But I used to drive into the AP building and pick up glossy photos on Saturday afternoons for the Sunday paper, and then I would stay in the office and strip the wires and make deli runs, things of that nature, answer the phones. And that's really the way I launched my newspaper career. After a year or two while I was in college, I started to cover games, high school games, Wagner College, what was then known as Staten Island Community College. And by the time I was in graduate school, I was covering the occasional Knicks game on a Saturday night. Soon after, I was working full time for the Advance. An old high school friend who happens to be fairly well known in New York, Phil Mushnick of the New York Post. He and I grew up together. Connected me to the New York Post, and from the Post, it was the Knicks beat after a few months, and then onto the Daily News, and then the Times for 25 years.
That's a great journey. And then so with a lot of those stops in between, obviously you have a great foundation in this field as journalism. And obviously, as you mentioned, you started when it was a whole different era. So there was no computers, there was no kind of technology as it is today. But you do still contribute. So I do want to ask this question: for what advice do you have for those looking to get into the field of journalism, especially in sports, and even take their talents to the next level, and even going to like a full-time position?
This is a question I get occasionally from some of the students I've taught over the last decade at Montclair State. And, usually, they're all usually asked with a bit of apprehension because there's been so much written about the decline of newspapers, the lack of jobs. What I usually try to say is, I don't want to mislead anyone, and I also don't want to discourage anyone at the same time, which is a neat trick to pull off. But what I usually say is the need for smart, aggressive reporting and storytelling is greater than ever, because the opportunities to deliver this material is greater than ever with the technology, obviously. I mean, just what we're doing now, a podcast, 20 years ago, who would have thunk, right? So what I usually say is the thing I'm not clear about or sure about is whether the industry will support the kind of jobs that were more plentiful when I was coming up. And by that I mean full-time employment with one organization, with benefits and a pension, and all those conventional, traditional things that certainly, the generation before mine and my generation became accustomed to. I think it might be more of a sort of a smorgasbord of opportunity. And so the thing I would suggest with that in mind is that young aspiring journalists prepare themselves in a multitude of ways, be well-versed in all the different ways of delivering information to people, and don't necessarily think of yourself as, wow, I want to land a job, I want to write for the LA Times or the Wall Street Journal or something like that. Be ready to go into any kind of any part of the media business, and be a good writer, or the best writer you could be, but also learn how to be a polished broadcaster, on-air person, and understand that self-branding is so much more part of the equation now than it ever was. When I was coming up, there was this notion that, don't make yourself part of the story. Don't push yourself into the spotlight. You're the storyteller. You should be anonymous. That's in some ways, it's almost, the complete opposite now, because, the notion is generate as many followers on Twitter and Instagram as you can. Be the person that people are looking to, the Adrian Wojnarowski or who's his football equivalent at ESPN, Schechter. Be that person. Be aspire to be Stephen A. Smith. What I worry about more than anything, guys, is that, like the country, where the middle class is considered to be endangered, and that we've become more of a society of wealthy and impoverished or poor, and the middle class has been shrinking because of those jobs, that are considered solid jobs, if not spectacular jobs, are shrinking. I worry about that, sort of the media kind of mimicking that, where you have people like Stephen A. and Michael Wilbon and Woj, who are making a fortune because they have succeeded, to their credit, by the way, at self-branding and having something that, people go to them specifically for, and breaking NBA news, or, an on-air shtick that is somehow generates ratings. And then a lot of people who are trying to make it but struggling to do it without any real job security or career security. I worry about that. And what I'm hopeful for is that, and this is kind of a long-winded answer, but I think this is an important question for young aspiring journalists out there. What I'm hoping is that what we're beginning to see now is the model developing for online supported journalism by readers. In other words, when all the newspapers back in the 90s went online, the attitude they had was, oh, look, this is cute. We'll put our papers online and ads, and we'll generate a few more readers, right? But they never saw it as something that was going to completely dominate the industry within a span of years. So from, like, say, 97 or so, I think the Times went online in 96 or 97, to the early part of this century, when all of a sudden you had Craigslist stealing all the classified advertising. And then you wound up with Facebook and Google, taking all the display advertising. The newspapers are saying, what the hell happened to our business? Then the Times, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, it was considered a radical move when they started charging for their website, went behind the paywall. First it was 20 free views a month, and then it was 10. And everybody said, oh, they're going to put themselves in a position where nobody will be seeing their work. And as the print declines, what will happen to the New York Times? Well, the Times made itself a product that people were willing to pay for. And so now, apparently, I think I just read a story the other day, with the combination of services that it offers, either news, crossword puzzle, cooking, sites and things like that, they have over 7 million paid subscribers. And now they make more money online than they do from print subscriptions, which no one would have envisioned 10 years ago. So I'm hoping that that's the beginning of the trend, and you see something like The Athletic, which I really root for, because it's completely supported by subscribers, not advertisers. And if that catches on and people are willing to pay to subscribe for their favorite, for the things that they feel that they need the most, then I think it will create the kind of jobs that I mentioned earlier. And, I would feel a lot better for young people going into the industry.
That's very great advice right there. That's great advice. So let's dive into your latest book, Our Last Season, A Writer, a Fan of Friendship, documenting the special relationship between a superfan of Michelle and yourself as the writer. So first, can you just give our viewers and listeners the backstory and the origin to you and Michelle's relationship?
Sure. Well, it seems kind of interesting that I have this book out that, is in some ways, as I mentioned earlier, a bit of a memoir, but it's told through the story of this 40-year friendship that I had with a woman who sat literally right behind the Knicks bench at Madison Square Garden. And I would say the genesis of our friendship was kind of formed out of self-interest, at least on my part, because I was a young beat reporter for the New York Post, and anyone who's familiar with that newspaper could understand the kind of insecurity that a 24-year-old kid thrown onto the Knicks beat, mainly because Rupert Murdoch had just bought the paper a year or two earlier, and he was moving all the veteran reporters to the side, and trying to get people who were going to do the job the way the Murdoch organization wanted it to, which is essentially grab readers by the shirt collar, as they walk past the newsstand with sensational copy and breaking stories. So here I am, 24, and there's this woman who sits behind the bench who is very friendly, to not just me, but a lot of the writers and team executives and players. And so I'm having these conversations with her before games, and I'm thinking, wow, she sits right behind the bench. She could be a good source for me. So that's the way, I began to cultivate this friendship, I would think, really out of self-interest. Um, and one advantage I had over all the other reporters is that the book was an afternoon paper. And so I had all night to write my story. We didn't come out until the next morning at 10 o'clock. So I could hang out in the locker room longer than my competitors, then go down to Charlie O's, which was the old bar connected right in the Garden Complex there on 8th Avenue. Go see Michelle, who was always in the bar after. She was like 17, 18 years older than me, and I didn't really know her backstory and why the hell she was there. But I could, talk to her about what I had seen in the locker room, because she seemed like this real super fan. And she could tell me what she saw behind the bench, and also what she'd heard in the bar, where a lot of the girlfriends and wives of the players, and sometimes the players themselves and the guys from the other team, would come in after the game. So, in that sense, she was, for me early on, a source. But over time, and really not that long a time, I learned a lot more about Michelle. She was a divorced mother of 5 who lived in Connecticut, who had gone through tremendous financial hardships, but had basically built a powerhouse corporate career. She trained corporate executives. That was her business. And she was someone who had essentially rebuilt her social life around the Garden. Basketball was a game she always loved. Journalism was something she always loved and aspired to when she was in high school. She was the sports editor of her high school newspaper and fantasized about being a sports journalist. But when you're growing up in the late 1940s and early 1950s and you're a female, there was really no pathway into the business. So the next best thing for her, when she found herself becoming acquainted with a lot of the sports writers, was to develop relationships and kind of live vicariously through us. And over time, she did become that source for me. She helped me break stories because, as I mentioned, she knew the wives and girlfriends of some of the players. And if she knew them, she was hearing a lot of what they were hearing, and they were hearing it from their agents. So, for instance, when the Knicks signed Bernard King to an offer sheet, and I believe it was 1982, right before training camp, she called me one morning and said, "I have some news for you." And I said, "What's that?" She said, "The Knicks are going to sign Bernard King." And I said, "Get out of here. Where did you hear that?" And she said, "I just heard it." And it was funny because she was playing journalist and she was protecting her source. But she told me that it was going to happen. Of course, I couldn't just write a story based on what my friend, a fan, told me. So I called around, confirmed the story, and that afternoon on the back page of the New York Post was a Post exclusive that the Knicks were signing Bernard King. So in some respects, it was Michelle getting to play journalist through me, her good friend. Over time, she became something much more than a friend. She became, because of her, just a really smart woman, but also her career expertise. She became sort of a career coach for me, and then in many ways a life coach, someone who was sort of the wise family elder that I hadn't had growing up.
It's very interesting, especially those little details in the relationship, her helping you out, not just with your job, but as a life coach, like as you just mentioned, and other stuff along the way. So I do have to ask you, with everything that you just said there, with such a deep relationship that spanned over decades, what inspired you to make that relationship and put it into a book for the public to see?
Well, after Michelle died in June of 2018, and I don't think I'm giving away the ending because I think it's, the title of the book is Our Last Season. So the title is derived from the 2017-18 season, which was not only the first year that she could no longer go to the games because of her deteriorating health, but also the first year that um, that I was no longer regularly around the Garden after, pretty much 4 decades being, a reporter and columnist for 3 different newspapers. And so the season is we shared kind of we shared, but for the first time not at the Garden, more from outside the Garden, in many drives from my home in Montclair, New Jersey, to hers in Stamford, Connecticut. We'd go out for dinner in her neighborhood and then go back and watch a Knicks game or a playoff game. And so, and because it wound up being the last year of her life, hence our last season. But I wound up writing her obituary in the Times. And when I was, which was something I knew she would really appreciate. It wasn't an easy thing to do because, normally people who, um, you know, uh, cure diseases and write Pulitzer Prize-winning novels get uh, uh, obituaries in the Times. But when I made a pitch to the obits editor, who I had a relationship with, and he was kind of tickled by the thought of this woman who sat behind the bench all those years and was sort of like she was like the polar opposite to Spike Lee, who sat directly across from her in Celebrity Row. Spike was there to be seen and to help his branding. Michelle was the non-celebrity celebrity, you know what I mean? She was symbolically located behind her guys, Um, But so he loved the idea of this woman who was, often quoted in the papers as the voice of the price gouged fan. And, for other situations, like I once did a column on Michelle's letter that she wrote to Dave Checketts when they created the Knick City Dancers, because she was offended that they were going to bring the Rockettes into Madison Square Garden and, somehow think that this is what true basketball fans want to watch. As it turns out, a lot of the male basketball fans did want to watch that, so it went over well. But anyway, so I wrote the obit, and before I did, I thought, well, I'm going to do some reporting on this. So I called Jeff Van Gundy, and so I said, we talked a little bit about the finals that had just ended, and then I said, Jeff, the reason why I'm calling you is because remember when you were coaching at the Garden, there was a woman who sat behind the bench, and before I could go on, he stopped me and said, "You mean Michelle?" And I thought to myself, well, here's a guy who hasn't coached in New York for 17 years, and went on to coach the Rockets, went on to become a national broadcaster, probably met thousands of people whose names he's had to remember at one point in time or another. And as soon as I mentioned that woman behind the bench, her name was on the tip of his tongue. And it really struck me as like, wow, it really reinforced the impact she had had. Just a fan, just a woman who had been there for 45 years. Just, the essential meaning or the impact that someone who's not part of the team, who's not part of the game necessarily, but someone, she could have that kind of impact just by being there all the time. And so, I've always known that courtside at an NBA game is really the most intimate place in sports, because um, you you're so close. You can reach out, literally touch these guys, and you see them so well, their faces, their bodies. Um, so, I I think when I got off the phone with him and after I wrote the obit, I started to think like, there might be a lot more to say here about the value of fans. Now, did I foresee a pandemic at the time when the book was coming out, which makes it something of a challenge to market, of course. But on the other hand, um, I think it's particularly timely, because if we've learned anything over these last several months, it is, and certainly the NBA bubble season, it is the value people like Michelle, because you can stage games, you can put them in a bubble, you can have them played in empty arenas, but I think we've all come to the realization now that a game is just a game without the fans. It's not an event.
Very well said. Very well said. And one thing I want to ask you as well is obviously Michelle, like we've been talking about, she was a household name throughout the Garden, to the Knicks, to their players, throughout mostly the whole thing. So when you look at Michelle's legacy, how would you break down her legacy with the Knicks?
Well, I think that she, she, as Mike Breen said in the book, it's people like Michelle, the Garden, its character. I mean, she's not alone. There've been many fans, who have been there, through the seasons and decades. I think her story is particularly different and unique, and of course, I think our relationship and what it became is quite rare. But I think someone like Michelle, I guess the best way I can put it is that what could a fan, players, if you're a great player, you dream one day of seeing your number hanging in the rafters of the arena you played in, like Larry Bird in Boston or Patrick Ewing in New York, Michael in Chicago, whomever, right? But for a fan, there are, interactions with players throughout my time at the Garden. I've known fans who interacted with players outside the arena. There was a guy named Steve Diamond, who was whose family was season ticket holders in the 80s and early 90s. And he was a teaching tennis pro. And one thing led to another. And the next thing he knew, out here in New Jersey, he was working on the backhands of people like, Bill Cartwright and Truck Robinson and Paul Westphal. There have been guys who shot around with, former players at the Y, at the 92nd Street Y in New York. But Michelle, a quick story, which I think sums this up. When the Garden was being renovated early on, around between, it was over 3 summers, I think 10, 11, and 12, Jonathan Sopranowicz, who was the Knicks PR director, was asking around for things like ticket stubs. They wanted to create displays in the Garden. And he went to Michelle and said, "You think you have any old ticket stubs?" Michelle never threw anything out. She hoarded everything that had to do with her love of the Knicks and the NBA.
Sounds like me.
And the next game, she brought this Tupperware filled with old tickets, and she gave it to him and said, "Help yourself." And in that Tupperware, he found the ticket from the John Starks dunk over Jordan and Horace Grant game, which was Game 2 of the 1993 Conference Finals. And that ticket became part of a display, which is on the level, I think it's level 7, or I think it's level 8. No, level, I think, of the Garden, outside the media, near the media press working room. And it's this whole display with this giant photo of the Starks dunk. And right below it is the ticket and a plaque that says "Donated by Michelle Musler." So my point is that if you can't get your jersey hanging in the rafters as a committed fan, you can be up on the wall in one of the, in the building that you were at for 45 years. And as long as the building is up, hopefully that plaque will be there as a tribute to Michelle.
And that's great. And then the last question I got to cover your book is, obviously there's a lot of takeaways in this book. As someone that's read almost the full thing, it covers your journey to a sports writer, her journey as the fan, the insight, mostly Nick's insight over the decades as well, and of course the relationship with Michelle, which we have talked about. So what would you like your readers to get out of this book when they read it from front cover to back cover?
Well, a lot of different themes that run through it, the value of meaningful friendship, mentorship, a shared love of something like, the basketball and the garden. But it's interesting because earlier we talked about, young journalists starting out in their career. I think the thing that intrigued me most in writing this book was the fact that we were both surrendering or losing something that was near and dear to us. And, in Michelle's case, it was avocational. She had, her career had ended, maybe 12, 13 years earlier, something she had to, transition into a retirement life of retirement. But now she was being forced to give up something that she loved dearly. She rebuilt her social life around the garden, and in many ways defined her character through, her devotion to the Knicks. And by the same token, I was in a position where I was transitioning out of something that I had done for 40 years vocationally. And, I could only tell, people, young guys like yourselves, that this is not something that you'll be thinking about anytime soon, but it's something that we all ultimately have to grapple with, which is the end of something that the end of a block of years that really define our adult lives. And it's a very difficult challenge. I mean, I'm still dealing with it in large respect, and I left the Times in 2016. I'm still working. I'm still writing. Obviously, just wrote a book, but most days I wake up, I'm thinking, okay, so sooner or later the editors at the Times are going to lose my number, and I'll run out of ideas to write. What am I going to do? I'm not old. I'm not young, but I'm not old. What am I going to do to fill the time that I'm so used to filling by producing, by creating, and by achieving? And that's a challenge. And so that whole concept, the transition into the next phase of life was really, I thought, like, I've known a lot of people in the last 10 years, whether it was the recession or now the pandemic, who have lost their jobs. They've been laid off and suddenly confront this at a time when, they may not even be financially prepared for it. So that aspect I deal with quite a bit. And if there was anything that I think I would say that attracted me to writing the book or convinced, besides the opportunity to tell the story of the friendship, it was that asked to explore it, not only for myself, but as a guide for other people, because Michelle was very helpful for me in making that transition from a full-time journalist to freelance and perhaps on the way to retirement.
Great. That's good. That's very
Yeah.
great to hear. So, guys, we will leave our last season, a writer, a friend, a friendship in the description below this episode, so you guys could check it out. Personally, for me, I've read a great amount of these pages. I'm almost done with the full thing, and I highly suggest this is a great read to read. So, but now we're going to move on to some Knicks. So, Doug, I'll let you take
So I
take
just
the
want to
floor.
appreciate that intimate story with Michelle. It kind of reminds me of some of the fans we have out in Barclays Center. So who knows, maybe one day someone will pick up and start writing that book. So you've covered 1,000 Knicks games throughout your career, and during covering the Knicks, you've covered 15 head coaches. Which team era stands out to you the best years of Knicks basketball?
Well, I came, I showed up at the Garden in the late 70s. So obviously the championship era was over. I've always said the most electric player that I ever covered around the Garden was Bernard King. I mean, it was a brief, uh, ascension for him at the Garden. Uh, the knee injury, changed everything. Denied him the opportunity to ever step on the floor with Patrick Ewing. Um, and so to me, the 90s really uh, were the years that were the prime years to cover the Knicks around the Garden, because even if they never got over the hump and won the title, they were in the hunt every year. and 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 even though they weren't really a sexy team in the mold of the Lakers or the Celtics or the Bulls of the 90s, um, they were a noble contender, and if they didn't have a superstar, charismatic superstar, and Ewing was not that, they did have, for the first part of that decade, Pat Riley, who was almost like their franchise player as a coach because he was such a charismatic and compelling character. And in some respects, Van Gundy, Jeff was being the polar opposite of Pat Riley. Pat was the perfect man, and in his Armani suits and every hair in place. Jeff was the everyman, the rumpled, guy who could have been any of us, right? So the Knicks were a compelling story in their own right, given their physical style of play. But the people they played against, the Jordan Bulls, the Reggie Miller Pacers, the Riley Heat after he went to Miami, those incredible rugby scrums of playoff games that would end 73-72. It was just compelling stuff. And, there's a whole generation, Knicks fans break down obviously certain age groups, but there's a whole generation, for me, when we say the good old days, I mean, I wrote when the Garden was easy about the 70 teams. So when we say the good old days, for my generation, it's that. But there's a whole generation of Knicks fans, when they say the good old days, they mean John Starks. And Ewing and Riley and Allen Houston and Latrell Sprewell. So those were the best years. The 20th century has been a complete and utter disaster. And with the exception of 2013 when they won 54 games and Carmelo unfortunately met Roy Hibbert at the rim in Game 6 at the end of Game 6, which shattered that dream. It's been an unmitigated disaster. And one of the biggest miracles, sports miracles of our time, is how the Knicks have managed to hold on to their fan base, which says more of a tribute to just how incredibly ingrained in a New York City culture, entertainment culture, the NBA has become as a night out, as a corporate, entertainment venue, as an opportunity to see great athletes, who are not on the Knicks. But it's just sad what's become of it. And I pandemic aside, because God knows what the coming season is going to look like. But I really hope that the notion that it's a Knicks city and it'll always be a Knicks city, no matter who the Nets have, that winds up getting flushed down the toilet in the next 2 years, because that arrogance, that the Garden and the Knicks have had just needs to be dispensed with. Something has to change to undo that dynamic, or even the notion of that dynamic. And, I think the Nets might have the goods to be able to do it.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. So, jumping to that, what do you think the Nets have to do to secure that mentality that the Knicks have, to potentially not, because now's the time for that next generation of fans to truly build your base. So, what do you think they have to do to run the city? Obviously, the Knicks championship was a long time ago, but it still strongly resonates with them. So, what do you think for the Nets' perspective?
Well, I think first of all, they have a much better opportunity with a team capable of getting to the finals than um, they did, let's say, at the start of this century with the Jason Kidd-led team in New Jersey, simply because playing in New Jersey was there were always going to be a blip on this New York City radar. So being in Brooklyn, in an arena that, in its short lifespan, has already taken on, a place as, as an important venue in New York. I mean, just witness the way it became a central meeting grounds for all the protests, over the summer, spring and summer. Barclays Center, you kept hearing it and seeing it on the news, right? That's how a building builds. That's how a place like a basketball arena builds its identity, not just through sports, but through, Madison Square Garden is sort of like an important place. It's right in the heart of New York City. And Brooklyn, of course, is, a hugely populated, densely populated borough with lots going on. So I think, you start with that. I just think that the Nets have to be, they have to take advantage of they staked so much on the spans of these contracts that they gave to KD and Kyrie, because again, with these superstars these days who are calling all the shots and they have all the opt-outs, you just never know when that era will come crashing down the way it did for LeBron in Miami and then LeBron in Cleveland after the return, Kawhi in Toronto, a one-year run. You just never know. So you have to take advantage of the opportunity right in front of your face. And so I think there's a lot of pressure on those guys to gel quickly and to assume the chain of command. By that, I mean on the court. Like, who's going to be the number one? Who's going to be the number two? Can Kyrie defer to KD the way he did to LeBron? Is KD capable of, physically holding up to that level of, performance and responsibility on his team? How do the guys, fit around them? I certainly think the talent is there, assuming that KD is, back to being himself or close to that. But I think, the one thing that makes me sad is that I think it's unlikely that there will be many fans in the buildings this season. And so, right away, that's a different kind of look to the league. Something, the bubble thing was a one-time deal, right? You can't put these guys in a bubble for 6-7 months. So I think, that's unfortunate. But if they can even demonstrate that they're worthy of, getting to the finals this year or something like that, and hopefully things are back in place so we have a normal 21-22 season, then I think they can capitalize on that to the point where both guys would want to stay and continue to run, say, to make it a 4 or 5 year run. And then, assuming the Knicks are still, in the process of trying to build something, how successful we won't know until we see how it goes. Then I think the Nets can really make strides into making this, a Knicks/Nets town. And from there, once it's established and once that young fan base is established, then all bets are off from the Knicks dominating the market.
Yeah, no, that definitely brings up a good point, especially with stability, like teams like Miami after LeBron left. Look where they are now. It didn't take that long. So hopefully post Kyrie and KD era, they can keep that kind of stability of being a franchise players just want to go to and keep that winning mentality. But before we keep talking about my Nets, I got to ask you, so in the book chapter, Dolan and the Death of Hope, when you look at Dolan's ongoing tenure with the Knicks, how would you sum it up?
I mentioned it before because I said this century has been an unmitigated disaster. There's no other way to put it. It's not just that the Knicks have been bad. It's not just that they've had some of the worst seasons in their franchise history, 17 wins twice in the last, 5-6 years. They've also been an embarrassment behaviorally, dysfunctionally. The things that have gone on because of the sort of the reign of terror that Dolan has created there. In the book, that chapter is not so much about Michelle trashing Dolan as a human being because she doesn't really know him. She wasn't that kind of person. but she sat behind the bench and Dolan sat nearby behind the baseline. And so she watched him, interact or fail to interact with people around him, the way he protects himself with security or his couple of friends, or almost like paid actors to come in and sit there as bookends. There's nothing that suggests a human side to him. And so that chapter is in effect because Michelle's career was about, she worked in human resources for a number of corporations, and then at the peak of her career had her own company where she would, companies like corporations like Procter & Gamble would hire her to travel around the world and work with corporate executives who were struggling, who were abusing their employees or hitting on the secretaries or whatever it was. That was her job. She was a corporate fixer. And so she fantasized. It was a conversation we had during the last year of her life, where she told me that she had fantasized in recent years about having the opportunity to work with Dolan. Now, of course, it was never going to happen. But so that chapter is in large part about her evaluating him as a potential client, and comparing him to people like Steve Ballmer and Mark Cuban, and how she would go about working with someone like that. So, the thing with Dolan is that he's, to Michelle, he was someone who was the son of a rich guy who, his father was very successful in building a television empire, a media empire. And Jim himself accomplished none of that. He was just handed the keys to the garden, right? As, here, Jim, have fun, play nice, right? Of course, he hasn't played nice. And he just seems to lack confidence and an understanding of how to conduct himself. He just seems uncomfortable in that role because it's not something he achieved. She also made this great point that she had watched him many times, videos, not in person, on stage, performing with his blues band, and that he always seemed much more self-assured in that role. And to her, it was pretty simple as to why, because that's something that was all his own. That's something he achieved on his own without his father. So, without getting all too psychological here about it, that chapter is essentially Michelle psychoanalyzing, Jim Dolan, and trying to understand why the man has been such a bewilderment, not only to the people who have worked for him, but to the Knicks fan base.
Yeah, no, definitely. He's definitely drawn comparisons to people in higher power in today's politics. So, as you may know, there's a parody account of Mr. Dolan, which is quite a fascinating character. Yeah, exactly.
I'm a follower. I'm a devoted follower.
Yeah, he was a former Nets fan who started this parody, and he's done really well for himself. So, with his leadership, I think Knicks Twitter's in good hands.
I know. I don't know if he keeps his identity a secret in general, but I do know who he is now. We have tweet messaged a few times. So
yeah, I met him at
not to out him.
Yeah, I don't remember if it's public, but I remember when he started the account. Prior to, I met him at a Nets playoff game. But what he's done is put together a strong, passionate fan base on there.
He's actually a guy who has done something similar. I mean, there are millions of these people, I guess, who have fun with parody accounts. But there's a guy who calls himself, it's like he calls himself pseudo-Fed, not Roger Federer, and he kind of has taken on the persona of Federer as this elitist who orders his serfs around, and all the people who work for him. It's quite funny, and he's got quite a following too. In fact, a lot of the players on tour and the broadcasters follow not Roger Federer. And I've always meant to ask Federer how he feels about that, whether he's kind of insulted or not. But I think I'll avoid asking Jim Dolan how he feels about Dolan J. Trump. Maybe he's maybe he's flattered by it because I think he is a pretty staunch Trump supporter.
So I got to ask one last Knicks question. Do you think they're heading in the right direction? And do you think this potential success can happen under someone like Dolan?
I think that, it can happen. I think, sooner or later, by just pure luck, they'll stumble into some moves that will work and they'll start winning games and he'll sit there maybe not slumping as much, but with a smile on his face. But, the odds, I would say, for any incoming Knicks administration are never quite good. And I say that why? Because they always inherit the blunders of the previous administration, and it takes time to dig out from those blunders, right? So if you look at the Porzingis trade right now, when it was made, I think it was probably about a 50-50 split, I'm guessing, in terms of where people came down on that. Remember, Porzingis was injured. People felt he was injury prone, and he's still very well maybe injury prone. I think he's got hurt again in the bubble. And I guess it was in the playoffs. And, the Knicks were taking on the draft picks. And people were saying, well, Dennis Smith Jr. looks like a player. But what's happened since? Luka Doncic has emerged as one of the best players in the world. Porzingis, when he was playing last year, looked good. He had a lot of good games, and he seemed to be getting better as the season went on. I don't think his latest injury is a serious one. And so now Dallas, when you have a guy like Doncic, and a Porzingis, you have other players looking at Dallas as a potential destination. So what does that do? Well, that renders those draft picks that the Knicks got for Porzingis in the deal as probably low-level first-round picks, right? What's happened to Dennis Smith Jr.? He looked terrible last year, right? He looked almost like a non-entity. So what do the Knicks get out of that deal? And, as they go forward, now they are, they're down the kid who everyone applauded them for picking, a few years ago. Even Tim Hardaway, you could make the argument that Tim Hardaway Jr. would have been the best player on the Knicks last season, right? It would be close, Julius Randle, Hardaway Jr. looked good because he was playing with a guy like Doncic and guys like Doncic and Porzingis, mainly Doncic, such a great passer. So, the new team of Leon Rose and Thibodeau and all the new folks that they've brought in, are essentially starting from scratch with R.J. Barrett, who looks like he could be a pretty good player, perhaps not a great player unless he develops a really good jump shot. Mitchell Robinson looks like someone you can work with, as a guy who can roll to the rim and dunk balls and block shots. But other than that, and a draft pick coming up, what are they really starting with? Not that much. So, we're talking about it presumably a years-long project because, they don't look like the kind of, even with the lure of the Garden, which has not turned out to be such a great lure for the best free agents, over the last decade. What do they have to bring a Giannis Antetokounmpo, to New York? Or, at best, maybe you're looking at a Fred VanVleet type player. But even there, I don't know what the main attraction would be. And then the other thing, and this is the last point I'll make, is that for the big superstars, we are also in an era where NBA players are feeling their oats socially, politically. They're speaking out. They want to be part of the discussion. They want to be part of the solution, as we've seen in Orlando. Whether you like that or not, that's the way it is. And can you imagine a player player in Madison Square Garden being paid by Jim Dolan, saying the kinds of things that LeBron James has said about the president or Steph Curry or a coach like Steve Kerr or Greg Popovich. I mean, the Knicks are even timid when it comes to releasing, organizational statements that speak out politically or socially. So, again, the players like, and let me just say this about KD. A lot of people like Mike Francesa went on the air and just like with the BS that, oh, he just didn't want any part of the Garden. He didn't want any part of the pressure. That's such nonsense. Kevin Durant understands intuitively what guys like Mike Francesa can't figure out in 20 years, that NBA superstars, right? It's like when LeBron James was drafted back in, what was that, 02, 03?
03, I think.
03. I was at the press conference in Manhattan when, they do before the day of the draft. And somebody asked LeBron, kind of half kiddingly, Cleveland's not a very sexy market. And LeBron just smiled and said, we're going to light it up like Vegas. You know what? For the times that he was there, for the years that he was there, he's right. Because guys understand that they are the show. And wherever they go, the cameras follow. So Zion Williamson didn't get to New York like he hoped to, apparently. He went to New Orleans. The cameras were there every time he stepped on the floor. And that's the way it is. So Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving, they're not thinking about, I'm afraid that they'll boo me at Madison Square Garden. They understand that they team up in Brooklyn. Brooklyn is on the map, right? And as long as, Jim Dolan has these draconian media policies that he imposes on his coaches and executives and players, that's another strike against, a top-level superstar coming to New York. Because they don't want to be lectured about what they can and can't say. They're the show. They want to do what they want to do, and they have the leverage and the power to do it.
That's very good points that you just made right there. So let's move across the river and talk about the Nets for a little bit. So one question I really wanted to ask you, and I was thinking about even emailing you about this when it happened. What did you think about the Steve Nash coaching hire?
Well, I think it falls into the category of the Nets trying to be fresh and new and different, right? And I think it's also a tribute. I know that Steve Nash as a person, a coach on the floor, all that stuff is very highly regarded around the NBA. But it just gets back to the point I just made about, players having the leverage. And we know from all the reports that Kevin Durant loves Steve Nash from the time that they were together. Steve is a consultant at Golden State and Durant winning 2 rings there. So the pieces all fit together. And once I didn't know, because I haven't spent a lot of time around the world, that Durant and Nash were good. Once I heard that, it wasn't surprising at all that the Nets went in that direction. And I think, again, it made a lot of sense for all those reasons that, the Nets, they want to be different. They want to try to present a different kind of organizational face, particularly from the Knicks. So, I think it's interesting, and I think the addition of D'Antoni as his
assistant
coordinator will be fascinating. So Amari Stoudemire on the staff, recreating a little bit of Phoenix East. We'll see if they can go a little further than the Suns managed to go back in those days.
And then what is your confidence level with the Nets winning it all this upcoming season? If you had to scale it like 1 to 10, what would you give it? Obviously, the free agency is bound to happen in a week or two, so there's a lot of movement still have to go on. But as it stands now,
I hope they sign Joe Harris. I think to have you spread the court with when you have a guy as creative as as Kyrie and LeVert and Dinwiddie. I mean, I suspect that we might see a deal to bring in a guy who would be a more of established third star. I'm not so sure I'd want to see them do that. I really like Karis LeVert. I really like Dinwiddie too. I'm just not sure there's enough shots and an opportunity for all those guys. But I really do want to see them re-sign Joe Harris. You know, I is coming out of its slumber a little bit. I think we're seeing the emergence of an improved conference. I think the Celtics, have a nice club. Miami is clearly building in the right direction, and I keep an eye on them too as a potential roadblock because they're not only a team with a terrific nucleus of talent, they also apparently have cap room coming up. So if you're looking at guys leaving unhappy situations, I mean, if things, let's say, don't go great, this year and with the Clippers, I mean, who knows? Maybe one of those two guys decides, to go play in Miami. They have the same sun in Miami that you get in LA, apparently. Same for Giannis. And any other potential high-level free agent. So Miami, Boston, Toronto's a good club if they keep their nucleus intact. Indiana, I thought Indiana was a little hasty in firing Nate McMillan because, Sabonis didn't play in the bubble after he got hurt. And I thought it was 2 years in a row where they were missing a key guy and, down the stretch and in the playoffs. I like their nucleus of talent. So I think the Nets, you put the Nets, Philly it's tough to read them and what they're going to be. But I think you put the Nets right in there. I would say that, I put them probably, if you're asking me to rate them 1 to 10, I would put them as maybe a 7.5 in terms of getting to the finals. But I think I'd put a lot of those teams around between 7 and 8. I don't think there are any 10s in that conference because as much as there are solid nucleuses and good teams, there's still questions about all of them.
Most definitely. You make great points right there. And then my final question I have for you is when you look at this upcoming season, obviously you saw that the NBA start date is December 22nd. So is that too early? Is that too early for you? And then the second part of that question is what are you most excited about with this upcoming season to watch?
Well, the Nets would be probably first and foremost on my list because it's funny, when you cover sports as closely as I did, a Yankees fan and a Knicks fan and a Giants fan, and by the time I was in mid-career, I was rooting for none of them. Just because you're there all the time. Part of it is that you get to see, you're in the sausage factory, you get to see what actually goes into it. So some of the people may not be as nice as you would have liked them to be. But mostly it's just that you're rooting for whatever idea you have that night to make deadline. And, sometimes you can root, when my kids were young and they were playing soccer on weekends, here in North Jersey, I didn't want the Knicks to win another round in the playoffs because I wanted to get home and be with my family. So, the rooting stuff your passions kind of go away. And when I emerged from it all, after I was gone from the staff at the Times, I found myself rooting more eclectically. It's almost like I don't have an allegiance to any one team franchise, but it might be a team from that franchise in a given year. And so the year that the Nets, whatever their record was horrible from the start. And then they had that great run and they made the playoffs. I found myself really into it. And both my sons and I were rooting for them to make the playoffs. So there is some carryover, some residual effect. And I find myself probably a little less so because, they're now front runners or expected to be anticipated front runners. So the underdog effect isn't in play as much. But I still would like to see them do well. So that's something that I am anticipating. I am concerned about, the coming season because, I think the country is is in a really bad way with the virus right now. And the NBA is, going to have to do it now the way baseball did it and the way football's doing it, which is guys are out living their lives and you can't protect them or shelter them. I don't think, like as I said earlier, we'll see many fans. I think they may try to have people in suites and people far removed from the courts, rapid testing, as you come into the arena, that kind of stuff. And hopefully that works to restore some sense of normalcy. But, I think, going to be, you're going to have to factor in the likelihood of guys getting the virus, and, so does that happen in the playoffs? Does that happen in the middle of the season? Do teams have an outbreak that essentially shut the roster down? Or I would assume that the NBA will have expanded rosters to deal with this the way baseball did. Does the whole team get shut down and they have to play fewer games or make up games? So it could be chaotic. And so then, you have to factor that into just picking teams based on their presumed abilities. And we're just not going to know until they actually do this. But all we can do is let it unfold and see where we're at. There may even come a point, where the season has to be shut down. I mean, we may wind up, where they play a percentage of the season and wind up finishing it in the bubble again. We just don't know. We're in such uncharted territory as a country, as a world, really. Or maybe we have vaccines by spring, and instead of 4,000 people in the building, we've got 12,000 people. So we'll just have to find out. But it'll be interesting.
It will most certainly be interesting, and we'll have to mostly wait until that day comes and see what happens from there on. But Harvey, thank you so much for joining me and Doug. We really appreciate you taking time out of your morning to talk to us. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be with you, both you guys, Chris and Doug. Stay safe, and we'll see you guys down the road.
Yep, I'll see you down the road.
Okay.
So, Chris, you just want to give the closing remarks?
Yeah, you got it. So, guys, feel free to send over any suggestions, questions, comments, or thoughts on any of our content by sending an email to wingspanpodcast@gmail.com. And do not forget to follow us on our social media accounts. But most importantly, make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your preferred listening service. And as for next time, stay classy, take care, and wear a mask.